Hey folks, Sam Loose here with Safari Pedals. I want to take a look at a plugin today that kind of turns the idea of reverb on its head. Typically when we think of reverb, we think of long tails, we think of adding sustain, adding length, but this reverb is really about adding depth, about adding width, about adding vibe. And even at really low settings, you're going to notice that this thing just kind of adds something that's a little hard to explain. So this is Rhino Reverb, which is based on a classic reverb unit that was traditionally used with hi-fis. And that sounds a bit weird because hi-fi folks are typically kind of purists and don't like to have anything in their chain which is going to kind of color the sound, and that's exactly what reverb is doing. But this particular reverb unit is kind of known for just adding a sense of realism to the sound, and as we're going to see, that is exactly what Rhino Reverb does. Let's check it out. So I've got 3 instances of the reverb here. Let's just take a look at the reverb itself. It's relatively simple. There's not a lot of controls on it to confuse you. It's fairly easy to kind of navigate your way around. You've got a blend down the bottom so you can bring it in or bring it out as much as you want. I've got it on a bus so it's all the way up. You've got a filter which is going to, on the right hand side, take out some of the low frequencies. On the left hand side it's going to be left kind of clean. We'll take a look at that. And width is, as it says, it's just going to bring the reverb out to the sides. And your reverb control here is kind of changing the overall feel of the reverb and the length of it, and how intrusive it is on the sound. But intrusive is kind of the wrong word because it does the opposite of that. It just helps everything blend in. But let's just take a listen to it with and without. I'm going to mute the buses and you'll hear how it just adds something. It adds an element. It doesn't sound like you've got loads of long reverb on. It just sounds deeper and wider. So I'm going to mute these halfway through.
Oh, she knows it's better when there's nothing left to worry about. Oh, she knows it's better when I'm taking the easy way out. I'm out.
Okay, so there's a few different instances there. Some are longer, some are shorter, and each are kind of adding to the depth of it. On the vocals, it's the longest, which is adding kind of a tail to it. But what you notice when we take the reverb off is that something is just missing. Something just kind of goes away and the whole mix just kind of feels a little bit empty. So I'm using 3 separate instances here. One on the vocal, which is the one that we saw earlier, which has got the reverb all the way up. So that's going to be a little bit longer. The second one is on the drums, and this is kind of a little bit shorter. So it's not going to be quite as lengthy, not quite as what we think of as reverby. And then the third one is on the keys, which is somewhere in the middle. So it's kind of at 80-odd%. So it's not too long, it's not too short, it's just right. So let's take a listen to these keys, because this is just adding a sense of space to the keys. It's not really adding anything too long. It's not your traditional kind of reverb. It's just adding a kind of a vibe to them. So I've got the blend all the way up. The filter is off. The width is all the way to the right. So that's 100% width. So you're going to get some more stereo effect there. And the reverb is at 82%. Let's take a listen and turn it off and turn it on again and just hear what it's adding. Just kind of dies without it. It's just adding some softness to it, just some sense of kind of realism and just some stereo width as well. So what about the vocals? Because this is kind of doing the most, I would have said. If I solo the vocals and we just take a look at the vocal reverb, this is the longest. So this is the most kind of reverby reverb, if you want. But still, it's not too intrusive. It's not taking over. It's just adding a sense of realism and a little bit of length, because I've got that reverb all the way up to the right. If you want to make it a little shorter, you don't want it to be quite as long, then as we'll see, we can just bring that down and it's just going to get a little bit gentler.
Oh, she knows it's better when there's nothing left to worry about.
Let's take it off.
Oh, she knows it's better when I'm taking the easy way out. I'm out.
You hear that tail. So out of the mix, it's obviously much more audible. You can hear what's going on. But let's bring this reverb control down, just take it back to the beginning and just hear how we can get a much more subtle kind of effect. So I've actually got the vocals going to the drum reverb as well. So I'm just going to get rid of that and just take a listen to just the vocals. Let's solo them and just take a listen before and after. This is the one that's got the most length to it.
Oh, she knows it's better when there's nothing left to worry.
Just kind of dies. And then bring it back in.
Oh, she knows it's better when I'm taking the easy way out. I'm out.
So this one, although it's got that length to it because the reverb control is turned all the way up, it's still got that extra dimension added to it, and we can retain that extra dimension but just get rid of kind of the length if we reduce the reverb knob. So I'm just going to take this down to like 25% and then gradually bring it up, and we're just going to hear that sustain just get a little bit longer on the reverb, and it's not going to get too intrusive until we get to the much higher settings as we had before, but you're still going to get that depth.
Oh, she knows it's better when there's nothing left to worry about.
Let's bring it back in.
Oh, she knows it's better when I'm taking the easy way out. I'm out.
It's just softening stuff, and it's making it so that it's almost like a transient thing. It's almost making it so that the high end is less obtrusive because it's just adding this nice little tail to it, this nice little shimmer and a sense of realism. Now, if I just solo this reverb here and get rid of the vocals, then we'll hear just the reverb.
Oh, she knows.
And we can hear exactly what this filter's doing. So all the way up, and it's filtering out a load of the bottom end. So you're just going to get kind of the mids and the highs in the reverb.
Oh, she knows.
But bringing it down.
It's better when there's nothing left to worry about.
So if you're worried about the bottom end getting too kind of clogged up, then you can just bring this filter up and remove some of the low frequency information in that reverb. I think it's all very well kind of going through this on separate tracks, but the best judge of this was when we heard it all the mixed together because it just adds this realism. But to the drums, typically when we think of drum reverb, we think of like sustain, we think of a big room, we think of length. But in this instance, it's not that at all. I'm just adding a little bit of dimension. So let's take a listen to the drums with the reverb, and then we'll turn it off and just hear it just kind of lacks something. It just kind of loses something. Real kind of lo-fi, springy sound. So it's an emulation of a spring reverb that, to me, when you solo it, you hear that it's a spring reverb. When you hear it in the mix, it doesn't sound like a spring reverb to me. It just sounds like a dimension box. It just sounds like something that adds that width and adds some depth. And on the vocals, I've got on a pretty long setting, so it sounds a little lengthier. It sounds a little more extreme than what I've just explained, that kind of depth. But to me, the vocals needed that. On a whole mix, it's just adding some width, just adding some bigness. And let's take a listen to this on a master, because at really gentle settings, it's just that. It's just gentle, and it just kind of brings everything together. And I was really surprised by this. So this is kind of a country track, and you'd typically think of a spring reverb on a guitar on a country kind of track, but to me this just works on the entire mix. Now I've just got Rhino Reverb here, and I've got the blend all the way up, the filter is all the way down, so I'm not filtering out any of the low frequencies, and the reverb is just shy of 12 o'clock at 42%. So I'm going to take this reverb off and on and take a listen. You just hear the track stop blending together so well when it's not on. So let's take a listen. just loses something. It doesn't sound like reverb. It doesn't sound like a really long tail on anything. To me, it doesn't really sound like a spring reverb in this instance. It's kind of malleable. It sounds like it's just adding some dimension. It's just adding some depth, some broadness. And the real test here is when you take it off, because the sound just kind of dries up. It just loses something and just kind of goes in itself a little bit. I've got the width not even all the way up, and it's adding a lot of width. It's adding a lot of kind of stereo space. And to me, this is a perfect reverb for... The difficult thing here is that I want to say it's a perfect mastering reverb. And you kind of get flamed for saying that reverb can be used at the master, but I think the proof is in the pudding. I think that just by listening to this, you can hear how it adds that depth. It doesn't add a real tail. It doesn't add reverby kind of reverb. It just adds something nice. Just take a listen to it one more time. And then bring it in. Bring the kind of length down. And even when you've got the reverb like all the way down, so it's just hardly even any effect in there, the unit itself is just adding some warmth and some character and some general kind of togetherness, if that's a word. And to me, this is the most interesting of all, because we're really adding like no reverb at all, to be honest. It's not actually lengthening anything. It's not adding reverb in the traditional sense. It's just adding some vibe. Just listen to that one more time. I've got no filter on. I've got the width up just slightly. Let's even bring that just to like the default kind of 50%. There's no level added. There's 0% reverb, no width, no filter. Just listen to the unit. Everything just kind of feels like it sings a little bit more. It just kind of floats a little bit better. You can get some reverb tones on this, you know, spring reverb, kind of like we had on the vocals before. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got something like this with all the controls kind of down and just hearing the vibe of the unit and just hearing that really, really agonizingly short reverb that's kind of just adding a little bit of tie-in to the whole track. I think this is a really unique reverb that has so many different applications. I'd urge you to try it on a master because it sounds absolutely fantastic and just ties everything in, adds a little bit of togetherness, there's that word again. And at extreme settings or higher settings, you're going to hear that reverb, but you're just going to get broadness, depth, width, whatever adjectives you want to use for a reverb that sounds like this. To me, it just adds an extra dimension to the sound. It's worth checking out. It adds a vibe, it adds a certain feel, whatever you want to call it. I'd recommend checking it out now. I'll see you again soon. Take care.